Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
So for our beginners, what can you grow plants in? Soil mixed with compost, potting mix with compost, water, although that's another class. Trying to grow plants in compost alone usually doesn't work very well. When you mix soil and potting mix together, sometimes you run into textural issues that cause part of the soil to then have available water and part not. And the same is true when you mix soil, compost, and potting mix together. So you have to be careful of what you're growing. Which one's better? Well, it kind of depends. If we're talking about soil in ground, that sort of thing, we're looking at something that has varying degrees of biological activity. More is generally better. Varying types of structures, varying types of textures. In an ideal world, our soil should be half solids, most of which being minerals, and then half pore space, that being filled with either fluids, that is water, or air. And if you are growing in soil, you want to check your soil regularly. We recommend every 3 years having a lab test like Virginia Tech's lab or any other lab test. The big problem with getting a DIY kit from somebody like Home Depot, not to pick on them, is that they can tell you what the soil pH is, but that soil pH doesn't tell you what you need to do to actually fix the problem. A lab test will look at how easy it is to change the pH of your particular soil and will give you a recommendation for either lime or, if your pH is really, really high, sulfur. Kits are available at most public libraries, at least in Prince William. I think in most of the big ones in Fairfax and Fauquier and Loudoun as well. Most of our local soils are forest soils. That's how they evolved. And so they're generally in the fives. Naturally, they're anywhere from about 4.8 to about 5.9, actually. But most of our vegetables need something in the mid sixes, usually about 6.3 to 6.78-ish. And if the pH isn't right, then nutrients in the soil won't be readily available to plants. Now, your other option is potting media, and potting media really isn't soil, it's structure. It's sterile, it's very light, it may or may not contain fertilizer, but it has structure for for specific purposes. We have some potting mixes that are seed starters. It's a much finer mix that makes it easier for seed, particularly small seed, to germinate. We have different types of things that we use for hydroponics. We have some exotic media blends that we use for orchids or succulents, or some of our other more exotic plants. And then just general potting mix works for just general plant growth. You can use the general potting mix to start seeds as well. It does better with bigger seeds, but it can be used as a seed starter. Some of the typical things that we see as soilless media ingredients, perlite, which is the picture of the white stuff at the bottom of the page, rock wool, which is the picture in the upper right, which is kind of I don't know, fiber. It has a texture similar to fiberglass, but it's not fiberglass. Peat, which is most of our potting mix, is made up of ground peat. Expanded clay pellets, which you see in the lower right. That's typically a hydroponic thing, but it can be used for other things. Ground pine bark is used a lot. Coir, which is ground up coconut husk. Vermiculite, sand. I've seen gravel used. It really just depends. If you want to grow something hard enough, you can find a soilless media that will work for you. Compost is something that we usually add to soilless media or to soil. The advantage is that it adds a bit of, well, for soilless media, it adds some biology in there. For soils, it kickstarts the biology and it fuels the biology. Compost is carbon rich. It's generally low in nutrients. The exact composition depends on what the compost was made of. It's high in organic matter. It may or may not have a lot of biological activity. It really depends on how the compost was made and what it was made from. Quality is a big issue in compost. What's done in the backyard may not be as good as what's in bags at the store, but it might be better than what's done at the landfill or this or that. There are a lot of things that go into the quality of compost. So it's kind of variable, and it's really hard to compare apples to apples from our different compost sources. Generally with plants, we kind of want to rely more on plant-based composts. Manure-based compost can have some issues with it, especially if it's not fully composted. And some of those issues involve not being able to fully kill pathogens. And some of it has to do with herbicide residual times passing through the animal, and you think you're adding compost to help your plants, and you end up really adding an herbicide to your plants and killing them off. So you have to be careful with manure-based compost. So what can you grow in Northern Virginia? Pretty much anything. Most of our vegetables grow well here. A lot of semi-tropical plants grow here. You can grow pretty much any temperate tree fruit. Growing them well is a little more of a challenge because of the humid summers we have. And then our small fruits grow pretty well here. Pretty much all the temperate small fruits do really well. Blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, all are a big part of Virginia agriculture because they grow so well here. So if you're new to gardening and you're trying to think, well, what should I grow? Well, first thing you want to think about is what do I like to eat? Because why grow it if you can't eat it? But this chart was developed by Ira Wallace, who is one of the owners of Southern Exposure Seed Exchange and a master gardener, and they do a lot of heirloom seeds. They're down in Mineral. But she made this chart of plants that are easier to grow than others. And what makes them more challenging kind of depends on the plant. For example, celery, on one hand, is not that difficult to grow, but where we are, it is because it's got a longer growing season than we can accommodate. Fava beans have some disease issues that are problematic where we are. On the other hand, beets grow really well here. And so it's just a matter of thinking through, okay, I like this. Am I better to start off with something easy, build my skills, and then move on to something else? One of the things that people always want to grow, it seems, when they're starting out is corn. Understand that corn, and any grain for that matter, you need a lot of space for. But when you're dealing with corn, sweet corn has more pest problems than, say, popcorn. So something to think about. We also get a lot of questions about the differences between what is an heirloom, what is a hybrid, what is a GMO. So heirlooms are cultivars and varieties that are developed over time from crossing different varieties together that do well in a specific locality. That's how they were developed. And so basically it's taking one variety and another variety, mixing them together, and over time you end up with a new variety that seed will produce a plant and produce a fruit that looks like its parents. Hybrids are a stage before you get to heirlooms. Hybrids take two different lines of a variety and mix them together. And so you have seeds that produce a fruit or whatever vegetative part that you're looking at, that are of superior quality than either of their parents. The problem is, if you then use the seed from that new hybrid, then you're playing genetic roulette, and you could get something that's just as good, you could get something slightly better, or you could get something awful. And so when we plant hybrids, we don't save seeds. Hybrids are usually developed for some sort of disease resistance, size, or flavor. GMOs, there's a lot back and forth about, are GMOs safe? Well, short term, we think they are. Long term, there just hasn't been enough time to really study that. GMOs are actually it's any organism where they've taken genetic material from another organism and planted it into something else's genetic material. So, for example, the one GMO that is available to the average retail person is a purple tomato. And for the life of me, I can't remember where the gene came from, but it was another plant that was put into that purple tomato. So unlike all other purple tomatoes, it actually has a purple flesh as well as a purple skin. We grew that, 3 years ago in our demonstration garden at Bristow. And personally, I found that it didn't produce a lot of tomatoes, and the ones it did produce didn't have a lot of taste. But that's really the only GMO that's available over the counter to the average person. GMO crops are limited in the United States, and you're far more likely to buy something that was made from GMO, whether it was GMO corn, GMO soybeans. You look at a Snickers bar, a Milky Way bar. Milky Ways, at least several of the ones that I've seen, have a little disclaimer in the ingredients saying that they were made from GMOs, GMO soybeans most likely. So GMOs are out there, but in terms of buying seed, except for one variety of purple tomatoes, you're not going to be able to buy GMO vegetables. So there's sometimes when seeds are kind of a bad idea. There are a number of plants that grow far better from starts instead of seeds. And the reason can be something like there's a poor germination rate, or it takes forever to go from seed to mature plant. In our area, the alliums, garlic, shallots, onions, that whole family, we use starts. With potatoes, we use starts. With sweet potatoes, we use starts, although we call them slips. With fruit trees are interesting because they're grafted together and they're clones of their parents. And then asparagus we grow from starts. Now you can grow anything you want from starts. If you're really new and seed starting is something you haven't done before, you might want to start with a start. Go get the 6-pack at your local nursery of peppers or tomatoes or whatever you want to grow, and start from there. Learn how to grow it really well. And then as your skills advance, learn how to start seeds. Or you can start at the beginning and start with seeds. And it's really a personal preference. There are some seeds I like to start. There are other seeds that I prefer not to start myself because I haven't had a lot of success with them. Generally speaking, the bigger the seed, the easier it is to start that plant from a seed. Some of the smaller seeds, sometimes if you're not really careful, you can actually plant them too deeply, and that's why you run into germination problems. So I often get asked, well, when can I grow this? Well, our normal growing season is about 180 days. Our last average frost date in the county, depending on where you are in the county, is generally about, I'm going to say the 24th of April to about the 28th, maybe the 30th. Typically, most people in Northern Virginia don't plant warm season crops until after Mother's Day, just to be safe, because you never want that late season frost kill all the plants that you've worked on or bought. And then that runs into mid to late October, again, depending on where in Northern Virginia you are, closer to DC and closer to, well, take that back, closer to urban areas, heavily urban areas because of the urban heat sink. And those in the eastern part of Fairfax and Prince William, that first frost date tends to be later in October. If you're closer to the Blue Ridge, it tends to be earlier. Even that, we can extend the season. We can use things like row covers, and the picture in the lower left is a row cover that's a mini, it's a row cover being applied to a mini hoop house. They've got raised beds, they've got PVC hoops, and they're putting a row cover material, and that will act as insulation, and it will protect those plants so that the ambient temperature outside of that is going to be a couple degrees colder than what's inside that hoop house. That a lot of times is enough to protect those plants and extend that season. Depending on the weather, that can be for a couple weeks or it can be a couple months. It also kind of depends a little on the plant. Then you can have much bigger hoop houses, like the gentleman on the right bending over tending his plants. A big hoop house like that is close to your greenhouse. The difference between it and a greenhouse is the greenhouse is heated. Starting off with a greenhouse, I don't recommend because there's a lot of management that actually goes through it, and sometimes it's not worth the investment if you're a backyard gardener. But there are ways to extend the season, and that is true both at the end of the season and at the beginning. There are people who will do insulated row covers to get started a little bit earlier. And you can even go back and you can start it even earlier than that. If you start seeds indoors, put them into an insulated row cover, and then you can get them in the ground before you otherwise would be able to. But generally speaking, we rely on this, and this is for Prince William County, although the dates are similar to the surrounding counties. Forgive me. Lots of things we can grow. Pretty much every vegetable we can grow. Our really cool season stuff, March 1st, we can get those out. Our warm season stuff, it kind of depends. Again, we're looking late April, beginning of May. Some of our plants we want to start indoors because they can be cold sensitive. For example, cabbage can handle frost. Cabbage can handle a little bit of freezing, but not when it's very young. And so we want to start cabbage 6 weeks before we put it out, and then we would put it out mid-March. One of the big mistakes that a lot of people make is it's warm. Like for example, this week, the temperature's in the 90s. People might be tempted to run to Lowe's and grab a bunch of tomato plants and put them in the ground. Well, we're still a couple weeks away from our average last frost. And you can get a frost, and you can even get a frost into early May, and it will kill your tomatoes. So you have to be careful of that. There are also some plants, tomatoes, peppers, peppers, and eggplants are big one. There are some plants that if you put them into cold soil, it's going to stunt them and they won't ever recover. So if you're putting plants, particularly, as I say, peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplants, if you've got starts and you're putting them out into your garden, make sure your soil is warm. And one of the ways that you can make sure your soil is warm is cover the area that you are going to plant into with a black trash bag for a couple of days, maybe a week before you're going to put them out. That will warm up the soil quicker, and you'll have a good warm soil to put your plants in. And you can see that we can get, for some crops, we can get 2 crops out of them in a year. For example, in collards, if you put them in early March, you start getting them mid-May. You can then turn around and plant again in August and get your harvest until close to when we're going to get freeze. Sometimes with collards, you can just throw a blanket over them at night when we're getting into later in October. You watch the weather. Oh, it's going to freeze tonight. You throw a light blanket over top of them, and that's enough insulation. You take it off and the next day. And depending on how our fall winters go, there have been some winters that even without row covers, it's been warm enough where we can have some of these cool season vegetables survive on their own out into December. When we think about plants, a lot of times people get hung up on fertilizer. The two biggest things that we need to manage when it comes to nutrients. One is water, because water is important in general, but water is really important in flowering and fruiting. So most of our plants are going to need about an inch of water a week. Ideally, we apply it once a week. If our soil can't handle that sort of infiltration, we try and do it twice a week at a half an inch. The smaller the plant is, the more frequently you water it. And the only reason I say that is because when we have a mature plant, its roots are deep enough where we can water it once a week. When we have a very small plant, its roots aren't deep, so we want to keep that root zone moist. Container plants dry out much quicker. The containers get hotter quicker, and so that water loss happens faster than in ground. And so container plants are going to get watered more frequently. You may end up applying over an inch of water a week because you're losing that water that you've put into the pot from evaporation. And again, depending on the plant, depends on when it needs water the most. With cabbages, it's when and lettuces, it's when their heads are being formed. With most of our fruiting vegetables, tomatoes, eggplants, squashes, it's when the squashes themselves are being formed. The other big nutrient that it's not really a nutrient that we want to think about is pH. If the pH is wrong, nutrients aren't available. And so you might end up dumping lots of fertilizer and the plant still can't take it up because the pH is wrong. But when it comes to fertilizer, we want to make sure that we know what our plant needs so we know when we should apply it and how much. When we look at fertilizers, most of us are buying bags of fertilizer with three main nutrients in them: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And they're listed on the bags as three different numbers, and that's the percentage of that element by weight in the bag. So for example, a good starter fertilizer, 10, 20, 10, is going to have 10% nitrogen, 20% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. Nitrogen gives us protein in the plant. It gives us green growth. Phosphorus is important for root growth and flower development. And potassium is good for plant health and the plant's ability to handle extremes of both temperature and moisture. We don't want to over fertilize because sometimes when we fertilize something too much, we get too much growth and it attracts insects. It also can attract disease, and it also can affect water quality if you're adding lots of nutrients and the plant's not using it all and it gets washed away with rainwater. I get asked all the time, well, what kind of fertilizer is best? Well, it depends. What does your plant need? But most of the time people are talking about, well, should I use organic? In the end, whether it's organic or synthetic, most nitrogen, almost all nitrogen taken up by plant is in the nitrate form. The big difference between organic and synthetic is that synthetic are in nitrate form. And so it is a quick get to the plant. The problem is you can shift the pH that way. You can drive your acidity up. And our synthetic fertilizers are generally salts, and so you can make the soil too saline if you're over fertilizing. Now, organic fertilizers are generally slow release fertilizers. Their nutrient level is not as high as some of our synthetic fertilizers, but they help feed the ecology of the soil, and they help the soil organisms, the beneficials that live in the soil, they help them survive. And so their release is a bit slower, but it helps foster symbiotic relationships that overall benefit our plants. Is one better than the other? Depends on your management system. When you start cutting out the beneficials in the soil, then the beneficials, the benefits that they give, fighting off disease, fighting off pests, aren't there. And so we end up having to apply sometimes fungicides, sometimes insecticides. And so it's kind of a trade-off there. A healthy soil is really going to be your best bet in terms of reducing the nutrients that you apply, reducing the pesticides you apply. A healthy soil is a dynamic soil. It's a living soil. The biology is plentiful and it does our heavy lifting. It cycles nutrients. It pulls water from all sorts of tiny spaces that plants' roots can't get into. It pulls water from deep in the soil. It pulls dead plant material from the surface of the soil down into the root zone. It converts minerals. And so what we end up with is that biology is cycling through all of these things. It's forming symbiotic relationships. In a healthy soil ecosystem, plants are giving away a quarter to a third of the sugar they produce. They're doing that so that microbes will do jobs for them, whether it's protect the roots from pathogens or send mycelium out to places to reach nutrients and water that plant roots can't because they're too big. All of these things are done when there's that symbiosis. When that's not there, we have to water more often. We have to apply fertilizer more often. We have to protect the plant against pests. And in a natural system, it's not perfect. There's always going to be damage. Nature hates a vacuum. And so there has to be balance. But generally speaking, in a healthy soil ecosystem, you have the good and the benign organisms are outweighing the bad ones. And you can improve the health of your soil by increasing organic matter, compost, manures, and using cover crops. And cover crops, it's a whole nother class, but the short version of cover crops are basically plants that hold an area in place. If you think about all of the solar energy that is sent to the earth over the course of the year, if you stop growing stuff in November and don't start putting stuff in the ground until March, you've got 4 months where all that solar energy is hitting the ground, not doing anything.
Zoom call.
If you have plants growing there, however, all that energy is being absorbed by those plants. Those plants are giving those sugars to the biology in the soil and keeping their populations high. And so when you get rid of that cover crop and put in your vegetable crops, those vegetables will benefit from having a higher level, a higher population of beneficial microbes in the soil. Now, pests are an issue. Unfortunately, we are in an area where, depending on the crop, depends on what the major pest is, but we're in an area where lots of our vegetables, lots of our fruits have pest issues. And we like to encourage people to use integrated pest management. And that means don't just reach for the spray, think it through. So first you want to do your research. What are the usual pests? What are the usual problems that these plants have? What conditions do these plants thrive in? What's the best management practices for my crop? So for example, if I'm growing tomatoes, the biggest problem with tomatoes are diseases. Most of our diseases are soil-borne, which means when the rain hits, especially when we have those big storms we have in the summer, it hits the soil and it splashes up and it carries with them those pathogens from the soil. So best management practice for tomatoes is making sure that there's something covering the soil. I like to use straw because straw also creates an environment that favors spiders, and those spiders will then turn around and help with pest control. So knowing your plant, knowing what attacks it, and knowing how to defend it is your first step. And then you want to look for problems. If you know what the usual problems are, you know what to look for, then you can usually nip things before they become a real problem. And then you need to make sure that you're accurately defining what's causing this. For example, in turf grass, there are a lot of things that look similar, but some are caused by disease and some are caused by grubs. If you think it's a disease and you put fungicide down, even though it's a grub issue, you've wasted a bunch of money and you've killed a lot of good fungus in the soil and you haven't solved your problem. So it's important to accurately identify the cause. Once you know what the cause is, then you need to make the decision, well, is it really worth doing anything about it? You know, if I've got, let's say tomatoes, if I've got hornworms on them, hornworms, if you've never seen them, they're about the width of your finger and they're usually about 4 inches long. They're lovely green little creatures that turn into rather large moth. And they're pollinators when they become moths, but on a tomato plant, they're a problem. Now, if you've got dozens of them on each of your plants, they're going to eat your tomatoes and you're not going to have tomatoes. If you have one in a group of, several tomato plants, is it really doing that much damage? So that's a decision to make. Do I really need to control? And then think about your options. What's the best way to control this? If you've got that one hornworm amongst your several tomatoes, well, that's easy. You pick him off and you drown them in soapy water, or you could put him in a bowl and let the birds have him. Birds love nice fat caterpillars. But if you've got an infestation of hornworms, well, you might have to go to something else. And so you want to pick the control that does the least potential harm. And you want to give those controls time to work. And if you find that that wasn't enough, then you kind of scale up. And so, you don't use a sledgehammer to handle a tack hammer problem and vice versa. So it's escalating the potential harm, but you want to start with what is going to be potentially the least harm to either humans or the environment. A lot of times people don't have enough training to be able to identify, okay, what is the actual problem here? Because this looks like that, and I don't know which one is which. Or I know what this problem is, but I don't know exactly how I'm going to fix this. Well, that's why we have the Extension Horticulture Help Desk, which is available by email and by phone. The help desk will take in pictures. Actually, if you want to bring in samples, we can look at samples as well. And we try and diagnose what the problem is, and we make recommendations about what are the various ways you can deal with the solution. Some of them are cultural. Might be that you're growing a plant in a plant that's not got the right soil, or maybe it has too much shade, or maybe it doesn't have enough shade. So we can start with those cultural things and then work our way up to if this is a problem where we really need to deal with it in a different way. So the help desk is there. It's a free service of the county. If you live in another county, while we can answer your questions, your local county extension office is going to have something similar. And with that, I will entertain questions. But remember, I want you to grow vegetables and complete the survey, there is a link and a QR code. So when we're done with all this, if you would be kind enough to fill out the survey, we would appreciate that. It helps us be responsible to our, why can't I think of words tonight? It helps us be responsible to our stakeholders, both the public and our funders, the state and the county. So with that, I will open it up to questions. I know it went really basic. It's hard. Zoom calls are hard sometimes because you don't know your audience, but if you have, more specific questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Hi. I have a problem with aphids on my roses and some of my vegetables. What would you recommend?
One, I would check your fertilizer. And I say that because aphids are one of those things where if you over fertilize, it will bring them. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the problem. It's just one of the things that can cause aphids. There are a lot of plants that just get aphids because aphids are everywhere. Usually, depending on how delicate the plant is, soap and water works really well. I like soap and water in a stream where, if you have one of those things that you can attach to your hose, you put some dish soap in it and get a good hard spray. That soap and water clogs their breathing and that kills them. And the ones that it doesn't clog, it knocks them off the plant. So they have to expend a bunch of energy to get back on the plant. If that's not an option because you don't have one of those things, or the plant's really delicate, just a spray mister bottle with, again, with soapy water, a lot of times will kill off your aphids.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And the nice thing about using soap and water instead of using an insecticide is that soap and water can wash off easily. And once you wash it off, you can go ahead and harvest it as opposed to an insecticide that may have a wait period. Do you have anything going on in the chat?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
How about cucumbers and their leaves turning yellow? What companion plant can I grow with it?
That may or may not be the issue. Cucumbers grow, yellowing leaves typically is a nitrogen issue, but not always. Nitrogen would be my first thought. But sometimes with our viney plants, it's important to remember that some leaves will grow, and then as the plant grows, some of those leaves will die off. So some of it could just be natural. Some of it could be a lack of fertilizer. I don't know if a companion plant, well, theoretically, you could grow some member of the bean family with it. And the members of the bean family will take nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil. So if it is a nitrogen problem that you're running into, if you have it growing with a bean plant, that would solve that issue. If you think about the traditional 3 and 4 sisters type of gardening that Native Americans use, typically you had squash, which cucumbers are in the same family, and some sort of bean together with either corn, sunflowers, or corn and sunflowers. So those beans were providing the nitrogen for all of those crops. So a bean might be an option. If you're growing, if you're growing bush cucumbers, you get a bush of cucumbers, a bush bean, another bush of cucumbers. If you're doing vining cucumbers, do the same thing. You can trellis beans and cucumbers together. Anybody else have questions?
Yes, there's one about mildew on, a problem with mildew on our cucumbers. This is from Margaret.
Okay. I have to think about this. So there are 2 types of mildew, powdery mildew and downy mildew. Downy mildew is on the underside, powdery is on the upper side. One of them, Depending on the plant, depends on which one's bad for the plant. In either case, most of the time that happens when we have humidity and we don't have enough airflow going over those leaves. And so those microclimates are handy for that mildew to form. So with that, you want to make sure that you're watering at the base of the plant and not watering over the foliage. You want to have it trellised out so that you've got good airflow. So if the leaves do get wet, the wind will dry them off really quickly. If you get stuck with an infestation at that point, I'd have to look at some reference off the top of my head. I can't think of what the chemical control might be for that. But this is a case where good cultural control will take care of a lot of that problem, which is making sure you've got that good airflow to keep the leaves dry and watering from the bottom.
You said it's powdery mildew.
Okay. Yeah, like I say, for some plants, downy mildew will kill them, but powdery mildew will do nothing, and vice versa. So I always forget those. I don't grow cucumber. Well, I do grow at our demonstration garden. We grow cucumbers, but I'm usually not the one fooling with the cucumbers, so I don't really pay attention to their diseases unless somebody asks me. So usually that's a case where I go to the phone and look it up to see what the control recommendation is. There is a document called the Home Grounds and Animals Pest Management Guide that Virginia Tech publishes every year, which gives you the recommended control for diseases, weeds, and insects of varying plants. Sometimes, because it's written by committee, every chapter is written by a different group of professors. Depending on who wrote it, depends on how easy it is to translate through. So again, our horticultural help desk can help you do that. And actually, break out of here for a minute. I know your screen's probably black right now, but let's look up powdery mildew in cucumbers. And I'm going to give you that answer. Any other questions while we're looking that up?
There's none in the chat. If anyone has a question, you can unmute your mic and ask it.
So, run up our pest management guide here. We're looking at home vegetables, and we're looking at cucumbers. So one of the nice things about the pest management guide too is it gives you the usual suspects. And typically the chapters are broken down into what are the usual insect problems, what are the usual disease problems. In the case of turf, what are the usual weed problems. Cucumbers typically get angular leaf spots. They get downy mildew. They get gummy stem blight. Those are the typical ones. If you were going to use a chemical on that, there are a variety of options. I would recommend copper because copper is our oldest fungicide and it's organic. And basically you're putting down copper either in a liquid spray form or in a powder. That is the product of least potential harm, but there are also other products that you can use. But yeah, if you run into powdery mildew on cucumbers, that's your answer. If you end up with with a situation where you just can't keep the leaves dry because we've had a week of rain, for example, that would be my go-to is copper.
Okay, there's one more question. Said, how difficult is it to grow potatoes in a pot? I usually grow mine in a grow bag, not a pot, but is that better? growing in a pot or a grow bag?
It depends. So the thing with potatoes is in the right soil, potatoes provide the most calories per square foot of any vegetable. That being said, what enables it to do that is volume. What I don't like about grow bags or pots is that you have a very limited volume of soil based on how deep the pot or the grow bag is. On the other hand, if you have a deep pot or a large grow bag, that can work very well. So if you've never grown potatoes before, in a container, what you do is you would put down 3 or 4 inches of soil. You would put down seed potatoes. You would cover that with 3, 4 inches of soil. You wait until they sprout. They'll sprout up. When those sprouts get to about 6-ish inches, you cover 3 inches of that sprout with soil and wait for it to go back up to 6 inches. And you keep doing that over and over. And as the potato grows up, it's going to make potatoes where the stem has been buried. And so with potatoes, it as deep as you plant a potato, and this is true when you put it in the ground, that's as low as you're going to get potatoes. And that's why having a tall container will give you more potatoes than having a shallow one, if that makes sense. But grow bags, I know people who swear by grow bags. I know people who have grown them in Rubbermaid tubs. I knew 2 guys who did it in 55-gallon plastic garbage cans, which was okay. The problem that they ran into is that it was slow growing because when it's low in that 55-gallon, it's shaded because the walls are so tall. The other issue is that you can't just dump. If you've got a small enough pot or a grow bag, you just dump it. There's no digging. With a 55-gallon trash can, it's a little heavy to pick up and throw down. And so you just push it over and you kind of pull the soil out. Unless you have a tarp down to recover that soil is going to go in your grass. But I know people have done that successfully. I like doing it in the ground, but if you've got heavy soil, sometimes it's a little more challenging. A lot of our potatoes here in Virginia are grown in sandy soils on the eastern shore. I would say probably somewhere in the 85, 90-ish percentage of all the potatoes grown in Virginia commercially are done on the eastern shore because it is nice, loose, sandy soil. The downside of sandy soil is that it doesn't hold nutrients well. And so if you're growing something in sandy soil, you definitely want to add compost to it. Because those guys, they fertilize a lot because they have to. And in a sandy soil, because it doesn't hold nutrients, they fertilize often, but they do light fertilizations because they don't want to over fertilize those plants. And I'm probably going on way more than you want to know about potato production. But in places like Idaho and Michigan and some of our northern states, they're growing potatoes in heavier soils. And I know here in Bristow, we've been very successful in growing potatoes in the soil. The soils we have in our demonstration garden are amended pretty heavily with organic matter, which helps, but they're still fairly heavy soils. And we still get decent sized potatoes. And most years we get a pretty good harvest. If you end up not having a lot of volume, a lot of times what you end up with are a lot of the smaller new potatoes. You don't get like the monster baking size potatoes.
There are no other questions in the chat box.
Okay. If anybody has any last minute questions and wants to unmute and ask, feel free to. Otherwise, we'll kind of end it here. I would invite you to come out to our teaching garden in Bristow if you are relatively local. We have one Saturday program a month from April to October. Typically, it is the second Saturday of the month. No, wait.
No, it's usually the first.
Yeah, it's usually the first Saturday of the month, except for April because of Easter and July because of July 4th. It's the second. We also have various classes like this and in-person classes on how to grow vegetables and other plants. If you're interested in turf care, we have a Best Lawns program that can help you grow better turf. And again, our help desk is there to answer your questions about plants, about insects. If you have wildlife issues, we deal with those. We bring in samples. Please don't bring in live snakes. We've had that happen. It's not fun. But if we don't have the resources to help you there in the office, we can reach back to the university and the research stations and get the answers for you. So as I said earlier, we are a public service, and our job is to help folks get the information that they need. So thank you all for coming out, and hopefully we'll see you at the next event, whether it's here online or if it's one of our in-person classes. Thank you all very much, and y'all have a good evening.
If you enjoyed this video, please let us know with your questions, comments, and suggestions for other classes. For more information on lawns and gardens, contact the Extension Horticulture Help Desk at mastergardener@pwcgov.org. Thank you, and we hope to see you next time.